What if a house of prayer was never meant to save souls, but to hide their vanishing? In the quiet hills of eastern Kentucky, a chapel rose before the wards it should have sheltered. Its stained glass shimmered in the dawn, its hymns drifted across the valley. Yet beneath its altar the blueprints whispered another truth, a descent into silence. 12 locked cells. A chamber marked only as Observation B, and the children who entered Thornhill Asylum, who never returned. Tonight we turn not to rumor, but to what remains: burned pages, hidden journals and soil that refuse to bury its secrets. Thornhill was not a mistake of cruelty. It was a system built for it, engineered, funded, and sanctified as reform. Before we step deeper, pause with me for a moment. Write in the comments where and when you're watching from. It helps trace how far these forgotten histories reach and helps this small community grow. And if you haven't already, subscribe and leave a like, so others may find the truths buried in stories like this. Because tonight, we open the silence Thornhill was designed to keep. In the hollows of Kentucky, where ridges fold into mist and valleys cradle fog, Thornhill stood apart, not in its size, but in the order of its making. Most institutions of its kind began with wards, rows of narrow beds, a dining hall, a crude infirmary. Thornhill began with a chapel. Its steeple pierced the sky before the first dormitory rose. To passing eyes, this meant piety, a promise that faith would guide reform. But to those who later uncovered the records, it revealed a deeper intention. The holy exterior was meant to conceal. Each morning, the sun lit the stained glass, painting the road in colors so radiant that travelers spoke of it as a blessing. Yet in county archives, preserved drawings tell another tale. Beneath the altar, a stair descended not to a crypt, but to a hidden substructure. 12 cells arranged in 2 rows. Each bare chamber contained only a drain and an iron ring fastened to the floor. At the far end, one larger room, Observation B. The architect left no notes, only lines precise enough that secrecy itself became part of the design. The placement was calculated. By raising the chapel first, the Calderon family ensured a shield. Visitors saw stained glass and pews, never imagining that below the sermons, children were bound in silence. Worship became a mask, and the building itself an accomplice. What was sanctified above was redefined below. The cross that crowned the roof was not a call to faith, but a decoy its shadow cast deliberately over what was sealed beneath. In the decades after, the Civil War communities longed for order. They craved institutions that promised to reshape chaos into stability. Thornhill presented itself as a place of reform where unwanted children might be remade into useful lives. The chapel promised guidance, discipline wrapped in scripture. But scripture, once drawn into blueprints and marked across a hidden basement, became something altogether different. Years later, when investigators retraced those lines, one detail chilled them: the absence of exits. The stair beneath the altar was the only way in and the only way out. Once below, the path curved upon itself, designed to block both sight and escape. Ventilation shafts did not lead outward, but upward, aligned with the choir loft channels, less for breath than for muffling cries. Every decision, from the thickness of walls to the placement of drains, spoke not of sanctuary, but of confinement. Thornhill's foundation was more than stone. It was a doctrine of silence carved into walls that preached obedience above and enforced it below. its first stone was never laid for prayer. It was laid for erasure. And in its patterns the truth emerges, faith used not as salvation but as cover. The foundation of Thornhill was not laid only in stone, but in belief. And that belief was drawn from the life of Reverend Silas Calderon. Before he was known as a reformer, he had been a chaplain in the war, a man who walked fields strewn with the broken and the dying. From those visions, he carved a doctrine that suffering could be reshaped, that collapse itself might refine the soul into something stronger. At Thornhill, this battlefield theology was no longer private meditation. It was written into policy. Prayers once whispered among the wounded became a framework of reform imposed upon children. Silas cast himself as both shepherd and overseer, a minister of scripture and of order. Yet he was never alone in his design. Around him, the Calderon family gathered, each member embodying a fragment of his creed, until cruelty was divided into roles and carried out as inheritance. Temperance Calderon, his wife, remained mostly absent from official record. Town memory described her as reclusive, her past clouded by rumors of time spent in an institution of her own. She was not a voice, but a presence, a reminder that silence itself could be inherited, guarded, and used as a weapon. Within Thornhill, she stood as a living boundary. What happened inside must never be spoken beyond its walls. Dr. Alburn Calderon, Silas's brother, supplied the language of science. Once a physician but stripped of his church endorsement, he turned toward what he called neurological mapping. His obsession was the mind's response to confinement, how silence and deprivation could bend thought. He designed chambers that stripped away sight and sound, leaving a child alone, with nothing but the pulse of their own body. Within Thornhill's plans, these were named silent chambers. They embodied his conviction that the mind could be corrected through isolation. His experiments imitated medicine, but rejected its mercy. Elias Calderon, another brother, acted as Thornhill's medical examiner. His role was not to cure, but to reshape the body until it aligned with the program's doctrine. Records of tools requisitioned under his hand tell the story: restraints fitted to limbs, surgical knives for incisions too precise to be accidental instruments, crafted less for healing than for adjustment. For Elias, the body itself became a page upon which the family's theology could be carved. Josephine Calderon, Silas's daughter, gave the program its sound. She led hymns, recitations, and prayers within the chapel, teaching children to tie sanctity to obedience. To an outsider, her work was devotional, a daughter's ministry of song. But within Thornhill, her hymns became instruments of suggestion. Voices were synchronized not only to drown the cries from beneath, but to train obedience into rhythm. Together, the Calderons functioned as one organism: sermon, science, surgery, and song. Each discipline reinforced the others until cruelty became indistinguishable from order. Thornhill's doctrine was offered as divine, but in practice it was familial, a dynasty passing down severity from pulpit to scalpel, from silent chamber to hymn. What Silas had glimpsed on the battlefield was refined into a system for children who could neither consent nor escape, normalized beneath the name of reform and sanctified as divine order. Within the chapel, the altar appeared unchanged year after year, a polished table draped in cloth, a fixture before which prayers rose and hymns echoed. Yet preserved blueprints and later testimonies uncovered its secret. Beneath the carved frame lay a trapdoor, its outline drawn with precision in the architect's first plans, though never once spoken of in ceremony. That door descended into a space named only penumbra, a word of shadow, the half-light between day and eclipse. The stair did not lead to cellar or crypt, but to a hidden annex designed for secrecy. At its base, 12 chambers stretched like cells in a hive. Each bare, each without window, each floor cut with channels that fed into central drains. Iron rings fastened into stone revealed their purpose: rooms, not for shelter, but for restraint. These cells were more than confinement. Their shafts rose into the chapel above, mouths opening into the loft where hymns were sung. Sound was carried downward, cloaking what cries might otherwise escape. Later investigators discovered those ducts bore traces of more than air. Heat could be channeled down to suffocate with oppressive warmth. Soil samples revealed chemical residue, raising the possibility that vapors too had been introduced through the very system meant to hide sound. At the end of the corridor lay a larger chamber, marked in the plans as Observation B. Higher ceilings, more ducts, and deliberate separation from the cells gave the impression not of refuge, but of oversight. It was a space designed to watch, to listen, perhaps even to measure. No records describe its use. Only the architecture itself survives, testifying to intention. Above, the chapel retained its sanctity. Sunlight scattered through glass colors danced across pews, and congregants sang in reverence. They believed themselves within a house of prayer. Yet every hymn rose as cover for the silence below. The altar was not just a table for scripture, it was a lid. This duality, sacred above, mechanical beneath, was no accident. It was the deliberate conversion of sanctuary into threshold, an inversion where faith became function. The chapel stood as mask, its rituals as disguise. What seemed to be worship was, in truth, an operating mechanism of control. And once the stair into penumbra was taken, the distance between prayer and punishment dissolved. What began as devotion ended in design. At Thornhill, the sanctuary was never the destination. It was the opening act, a curtain that parted before the machinery began. Among the few texts to survive Thornhill's ruin, none are more haunting than the scorched fragments later recovered from its ashes. These brittle pages, half burned, half preserved, are now known as the doctrine of broken things. Their words do not carry the cadence of scripture but the command of instruction, as if holy verse had been stripped of spirit and pressed into service as procedure. The child was not described as a soul but as a vessel, something to be fractured so that grace might be poured in. One line reads, its edges blackened as though the words themselves resisted survival. A vessel unbroken cannot contain grace. Another insists, collapse is not failure but the very precondition of reform. Here pain is elevated into sanctity. Suffering is not pitied but celebrated as proof of purification. Theology hardened into method. Steps were outlined by which spirit could be bent into compliance. At Thornhill, these fragments were not merely read, they were lived. Hunger was prescribed as fasting, restraint reframed as posture, isolation renamed silence before God. Every deprivation was recast as an act of devotion, every wound reinterpreted as the mark of grace's entry. The Calderon dynasty did not simply read scripture, they amputated it, reducing its lines until only the words that justified cruelty remained. Children bore the weight of this mutilation. They were told, their cries echoed sanctity. Their collapse proved obedience. Collapse was not to be prevented, it was induced. For only in collapse, the doctrine said, could the vessel be emptied, ready to receive divine order. In this way, suffering was not incidental at Thornhill. It was the institution's pulse, its evidence of purpose. Investigators decades later would remark on how seamlessly scripture bled into routine. Locking a child in a cell was annotated with notes about the solitude of prayer. The release of chemical drafts was described as stilling the vessel for grace. Even surgical cuts were glossed with verses that equated incision with correction. The line between theology and practice blurred until it vanished. Cruelty was not enacted against faith, but through it. What might have been Silas Calderon's private meditations on a battlefield was transcribed into a manual for an entire family, passed hand to hand until it guided their daily work. By reducing scripture to fragments and reassembling it into commands, Thornhill ensured that devotion could be recited even as harm was inflicted. Today, the ash-smeared remnants of the doctrine of broken things rest in archival folders. Their words remain faint, their burn marks permanent. They testify not only to what was written, but to what was done. Silent witnesses of a faith hollowed out of grace, recast as a blueprint for suffering. Yet Thornhill's cruelty began long before a child was locked in a chamber. The mechanism of disappearance started not with stone or iron, but with paper. Admission began with an involuntary placement form. These documents bore signatures not of children, but of others, a magistrate, a parish overseer, or a relative eager to relieve a burden. Their language was stripped of identity, names reduced to initials, ages blurred into estimates, descriptions replaced by categories. In these substitutions, erasure began before confinement ever did. The most chilling of these designations was Category 3. No definition appeared in public records, only a single repeated note, non-viable. To be placed in Category 3 was to become less than a patient, less even than a subject of reform. Such children required no bed, no ration, no accounting. They entered the records once only to vanish from every page thereafter. The numbers reveal the depth of this disappearance. Between 1865 and 1897, Thornhill officially recorded 223 admissions. These names appear in county ledgers, cited in reports to oversight boards. Yet requisitions for food, clothing, and restraints tell another story. The quantities imply a population nearly 3 times larger. Cross-referenced against fragmentary intake lists, the discrepancy sharpens. At least 142 children arrived between 1870 and 1889 who were never assigned a bed, never listed in meal records. They appear once then vanish. The ledger itself became an accomplice. Absence was disguised as neat columns of ink. Each omission smoothed the institution's facade as if the children had never entered its doors at all. No report declared them missing. No tally announced their loss. Bureaucracy in Thornhill was not an accident, it was a design. The language of admission forms, involuntary, non-viable corrective placement, was crafted to erase without protest. Children became burdens, transferred vessels, reassigned errors corrected by removal from public sight. Once stamped, their existence ended. When investigators decades later tried to reconcile the numbers they encountered, the same void the children had faced. Pages balanced their columns, but lives remained unaccounted. The paper trail ended not in explanation but in silence, as though the ledgers themselves had sworn to protect the truth. The chapel above may have hidden the cells below, but it was paper and ink that erased the children first. Thornhill's machinery of disappearance did not begin with locks or walls. It began with forms. In the quiet of an office with pen strokes and seals, lives were reduced to categories that excused their neglect. And as the years passed, that arithmetic of cruelty multiplied until the ledger stood as both witness and accomplice, an account book that testified not to care, but to vanishing. The earliest signs of Thornhill's true purpose did not come from archives or excavations, but from those who glimpsed fragments of it while the institution still lived. They were few, often punished and quickly forgotten. Each left behind only traces, their voices smothered almost as soon as they were spoken. Yet in their testimony, we see both the brutality of Thornhill and the lengths taken to bury it. In the winter of 1873, a coal deliverer made his routine trip to the asylum. His task was simple: unload barrels for the boilers that heated the chapel and the basement below. But as he worked, he heard something he could not explain, a rising chorus of cries, faint but unmistakable, drifting upward through the vents. Disturbed, he reported in town that children must be kept like animals beneath the altar. Days later, his body was found at the base of a quarry. The death was labeled a misstep, an accident. His note of complaint disappeared. Only his last signed delivery remains. 2 years later, in 1875, a fuller account surfaced. Nurse Abigail Bellamy, one of the few attendants not bound by Calderon blood, filed a report with county officials. She described overcrowded cells, restraints on children too young to speak, and chemical drafts administered to still their lungs. Her words were precise, detailed enough to demand investigation. But before her complaint could be reviewed, she herself was confined, declared unstable, transferred into another asylum, and dead within months. Her report buried in Thornhill's overseas files. These were not isolated silences. They were a pattern. Testimony arose and testimony was erased, whether by accident, accusation, or reassignment. Thornhill did not survive because no one knew. It survived because its neighbors permitted absence to explain everything. A man's fall, a woman's instability. Such phrases allowed its walls to stand unquestioned. The chorus of voices that might have grown into resistance never formed. Each cry remained an audience of one, heard only briefly before it was extinguished. Complicity spread beyond silence. Townspeople saw the chapel's glass ignite. At dawn, heard hymns drifting across the fields and accepted them as proof of sanctity. Those who delivered supplies or balanced accounts rarely asked why numbers did not match or why children entered but were not seen again. Faith was placed in the Calderon name in the comfort of believing discipline was reform. By the decade's end, Thornhill's cruelty was not unknown, it was simply unacknowledged. Behind the chapel and its hidden cells was more than a family's will. There was a network. Its name was the Society for Moral Architecture, a circle of financiers, physicians, and reformers in Louisville. Publicly, they posed as philanthropists devoted to institutional improvement. But to Thornhill, they were both patron and architect, supplying the language, the tools, and the justifications that transformed cruelty into a system. Donor lists preserved in county archives show requisitions not only for food or bedding, but for surgical lamps, specialized restraints, and devices marked behavioral correction. Their notes described these as instruments of refinement, the same word Calderon sermons used to sanctify punishment. To the society, Thornhill was never an isolated experiment. It was a proving ground, a model to observe, measure, and if successful, expand. Among the most chilling artifacts are memos referencing eraser metrics. They were not sermons, but tables. Intervals measuring how long a child could be silenced, how many hours of restraint could be endured before collapse, how obedience might be sustained without relapse. Suffering was converted into units of account, each figure becoming evidence of progress, justification for more funding. Here, cruelty was not improvised. It was standardized. Silence itself became data. What scripture had once justified, columns and ledgers now rationalized. A child's compliance no longer required belief, it required only measurement. Thornhill, in this way, ceased to be unique. Surviving memoranda call it a viable model, its design transferable to future houses of reform. Chapel first construction, hidden basements, silence as obedience. These principles were circulated outward as if cruelty itself could be replicated and improved upon. The most disturbing part was not the brutality, but its normalization. Numbers disguised suffering as progress. Ledgers replaced testimonies. Reports spoke more clearly than witnesses because numbers did not accuse. Thornhill's chapel may have hidden its cells, but the society ensured its methods were seen by those who wished to reproduce them. What others might call abuse, they reframed as success. What might have been dismissed as an aberration in a Kentucky hollow was codified into practice, carried outward as architecture and reform. In the end, Thornhill was not the whole story. It was only one page in a larger ledger, one site in a program that believed silence could be quantified, obedience charted, and human suffering reduced to clean columns of architectural reports. And at Thornhill, obedience was never left to chance. What sermons and confinement could not secure, chemistry was made to supply. In the notes of Mercy Calderon, daughter of the dynasty that ruled the asylum, compliance was measured not by prayer or posture but by dosage. Her surviving fragments describe a sedative mixture of opium tincture and mercuric chloride administered to children in careful intervals. A formula, clinical in design but theological in purpose, to still resistance, soften will, and make submission resemble devotion. The sedative Mercy devised came to be known even in her own documents as the draft. It was measured into small glass vials labeled only with alphanumeric codes. Each child reduced to a sequence of entries. Test 4C. Test 7B. Their bodies charted not as lives but as responses, their endurance catalogued as though obedience were only physiology. The effects were consistent. Slurred speech, slowed movement, a pliant body. In that haze, children could be directed to tasks requiring silence and repetition. Chief among them was the textile workshop, hidden in Thornhill's lower floors. Rows of looms and tables stood where hymns could not reach. Sedated children spun thread-stitched garments and wove patterns their weakened hands could barely guide. The draft ensured that fatigue looked like discipline and that labor could be extracted without defiance. In those rooms, the rhythm of shuttle and needle became a ritual of its own work, recast as worship. Mercy's records reveal she did not regard these trials as punishment, but as experiments. The dosage altered, the intervals shifted, the environment manipulated. The goal was not care nor correction, but the perfection of compliance. To her, obedience was not chosen, it was induced. Each coded entry in her ledger carried both clinical detachment and theological conviction, as if submission were the natural endpoint of sanctification. The presence of mercuric chloride in her mixture ensured the cost was permanent. Survivors' testimonies speak of trembling hands, blurred sight sensitivity to light, compliance purchased with slow deterioration, silence extracted at the expense of the body itself. At Thornhill, obedience was no longer earned through persuasion or beaten into being. It was manufactured at the cellular level, swallowed and absorbed until surrender tasted like medicine. Every garment sewn under sedation became less a piece of clothing than an artifact of control stitched through haze patterned with fatigue. Survivors later described the workshop not as labor but as an extension of confinement, where every seam carried evidence of chemical coercion. Mercy Calderon's vision had moved discipline beyond the sermon and the cell. It had become liquid measured by the spoonful, tested against trembling hands and faltering voices. Among the few artifacts that survive Thornhill, one of the smallest carries the greatest weight. A pocket hymnal, leather-bound and broken at the spine. At first glance, it is ordinary, filled with verses sung in chapels across the region. But in its margins, between the lines of devotion, a child's hand has written fragments. What should have been a book of worship became instead a hidden record of what lay beneath the sanctuary. The handwriting was small, uneven but deliberate. Scholars attribute it to Delilah M., age 8, recorded briefly on intake lists before her name vanishes. Her words endure only here. On one page, she sketched a square labeled church with a smaller rectangle beneath marked room. The phrase under the church repeated 3 times as if to ensure anyone who found it would not miss the truth. Another hymn refrain is interrupted with 12 doors, a child's attempt to mark the number of cells below. Other notes reveal the daily intersection of ritual and dread. A verse about prayer underlined beside it, the words, "Sing so they don't hear." Not worship, but camouflage. Another page. "Chairs too small," a phrase that evokes the restraints made for children's bodies. Her clarity lay not in detail, but in stark precision. Where official records obscure, her few words expose. Near the back, in shaky script on thinning pages, Delilah wrote, "If you find this, I'm probably not." The sentence halts unfinished. No continuation, no signature. Only the absence she knew awaited her. It is a child's attempt to record her own erasure. This hymnal is not only an artifact, it is a map. Each note a coordinate pointing to the architecture below the 12 doors. The hidden room, the enforced singing. More than blueprints or ledgers, it is the clearest testimony because it speaks without calculation. Just a child fitting truth into the margins of song. For decades after Thornhill's closure, townspeople whispered of a ghost who wandered the abandoned halls. They called her the woman in white, a pale figure, glimpsed by trespassing children, said to vanish when approached. Her presence tied to faint cries, said to echo through the ruined chapel. The legend endured, repeated around kitchen tables passed as folklore. But records uncovered in recent years reveal that the figure was not a spirit, but a woman who lived and resisted within Thornhill's walls. Her name was Elelanena Witt, sometimes written as Elelanar, an attendant on the asylum's periphery in the 1880s. Unlike others, she did not turn away. She began to collect what could not be spoken, embedding it into the very materials she handled. Linen stitched with hidden seams, children's names worked into cuffs' initials disguised in hems. Small acts of defiance, fragile by themselves, but together forming a secret archive meant to outlast silence. Her defiance is sharpened by what she left behind. In 1995, during demolition, workers found a satchel believed to have been hers. Inside was a glass vial sealed with wax, its label, Fading Mercy's Draft Test 4C. The residue inside later confirmed as a mixture of opium and mercuric chloride. Preserving it had been an act of enormous risk-proof that she sought not only to resist, but to ensure evidence survived. The satchel contained more a locket with a child's lock of hair, initials faintly etched on the rim. Folded slips of paper, listing times and codes for specific rooms. Scraps of linen, marked with symbols, later matched to names in Thornhill's records. Together, they form another ledger not written in ink, but in fabric fragments and memory. A record meant to outlast her own disappearance. Longtemps après la fermeture des portes par Thornhill, les témoignages qui ont survécu ont révélé que les Lanena avaient tenté de faire sortir clandestinement au moins 2 enfants des lieux. L'un d'eux n'a jamais survécu. L'autre, connu sous un nom vague dans le folklore, Anal, racontait avoir été guidé à travers des tunnels secrets avant d'être séparé de son sauveur. Ces fragments, bien que fragiles, correspondent à la piste laissée par Lanena, une femme qui a risqué sa vie et ses souvenirs au cœur même d'un lieu créé pour les effacer. La légende l'appelle la femme en blanc, une silhouette qui glissait à travers les couloirs anonymes dans les archives, ne laissant aucune trace autre que ce qui était caché dans des tissus et des bocaux en verre. Mais elle n'était pas un fantôme. C'était un témoin, une rebelle, qui enregistrait, cachait, cousait des noms dans du lin, scellait des spécimens dans des fioles. Le blanc n'est pas une lumière surnaturelle, mais des toiles silencieuses qui renferment l'interdit, des noms trop dangereux pour être prononcés. Lanena 8 n'est pas un fantôme. Archiviste de la résistance, elle transforme le tissu, le verre et le silence en témoignage. Ainsi, le silence de Thornhill n'est jamais absolu. En 1997, lorsque les équipes de démolition commencèrent à démanteler les ruines de Thornhill, elles tombèrent sur un mur inhabituellement épais. Plus de 60 cm de béton massif bloquaient un vide qui n'apparaissait sur aucun plan. Les foreuses vrombirent pendant des heures la poussière et le calcaire tourbillonnèrent jusqu'à ce qu'une cellule secrète soit révélée. Elle fut plus tard nommée cellule 1B ou dans les archives fragmentaires qui ont survécu d'Edwing. La chambre froide ne mesurait qu'environ 4,5 mètres sur 3 et moins de 2,5 mètres de haut. Elle était vide. Il n'y avait qu'une seule chaise au milieu, les pieds boulonnés au sol. Les accoudoirs portaient les traces de rouille des boulons en fer qui maintenaient autrefois les cordes. Ce n'était pas une chaise, mais un lieu destiné à maintenir le silence. L'air sentait encore mauvais, même après 100 ans. Des échantillons de sol et de murs ont révélé des traces de phénol, de chloroforme et de mercure vaporisé, des substances utilisées pour anesthésier et perturber la conscience. Les conduits de ventilation au-dessus de la tête suggéraient que les vapeurs toxiques avaient pu être pompées de l'extérieur. Cette chaise dans cet espace étouffant n'était pas un simple meuble. C'était un outil de coercition, et autour d'elle, des preuves éloquentes subsistaient. Dans un coin, 17 paires de chaussures d'enfants ont été retrouvées attachées en paquets par leurs lacets, comme pour ne jamais être séparées. Le cuir était pourri, les coutures effilochées, mais les pointures étaient indéniables. Toutes appartenaient à des enfants. Sur le mur, le même nom était gravé des dizaines de fois dans le plâtre rut. Les lettres se répétaient à différentes hauteurs, en bas en haut. De petites mains devaient se lever pour les graver. Peut-être pas une, mais plusieurs mains avaient écrit ensemble, comme un cœur pressant, déterminé à ne pas laisser le nom disparaître. Qui était Ruth? Une enfant? Ou toutes? La réponse était perdue, mais la gravure subsistait, tel un cri muet, venant d'un lieu de silence forcé. Dans les cendres restantes, des gens ramassèrent un morceau de tissu plié. Dessus, avec du fil délavé, 4 personnages étaient brodés. 3 avaient des visages distincts. Le 4e, sans visage. Une omission délibérée, un signe de mort qui ne laissait aucune image. C'était peut-être l'œuvre d'Elelanena ou d'une autre main, mais c'était le témoignage ultime, une absence gravée dans le tissu et l'aiguille. La cellule 1B n'était pas un établissement pénitentiaire. C'était un lieu de destruction. L'épais mur de béton l'avait scellée pendant des générations. Mais lorsqu'on l'a déterrée, la pièce elle-même en a témoigné, la chaise à bandage, l'odeur persistante des produits chimiques, les chaussures à bandage, le nom répété de Ruth. Chaque élément parlait. Et ensemble, le silence à Thornhill n'était pas naturel. Il a été construit, imposé, puis enterré, jusqu'à ce que les murs cèdent. Selon le registre officiel, entre 1865 et 1897, Thornhill a enregistré 223 enfants admis dans l'établissement. Les dossiers étaient net monographiés, les colonnes alignées. En apparence, tout était parfait. Mais l'inventaire des fournitures révélait une toute autre histoire. La nourriture, les lits, les vêtements et les chaînes commandées ne concernaient pas 200 personnes, mais près de 600. Une vérification révéla qu'au moins 142 enfants furent envoyés à Thornhill entre 1870 et 1889, dont les noms figuraient sur les documents de transport ou les registres paroissiaux, mais qui n'existaient pas dans les registres officiels. Aucun lit ne leur fut fourni, aucune ration ne leur fut distribuée. Ils franchirent le portail et disparurent sous l'enclos. S'il s'était agi d'une simple erreur administrative, le sol ne les aurait pas trahis. Plus tard, un relevé révéla derrière la chapelle 17 dépressions rectangulaires aussi uniformes que des tombes peu profondes. Aucun document ne le mentionnait, mais le sol cédait malgré tout. Et sous la structure, les traces étaient encore plus terribles. Un four souterrain, des murs de pierre noircis, des cendres mêlées de phosphate de calcium, des restes d'ossements humains brûlés à haute température. Ce n'était pas un foyer, c'était un mécanisme de destruction, et cela, ainsi que les tombes peu profondes, a révélé les disparités que les livres s'efforçaient tant de dissimuler. Les enfants disparus des archives de Thornhill n'étaient là pas accidentels. Ils étaient intentionnels, des vies omises des chiffres, afin que leur effacement ne nécessite aucune explication. Les registres étaient soigneusement conservés, mais le sol accidenté, les fourneaux, à l'odeur chimique et l'écart entre les noms enregistrés et les fournitures commandées racontaient une toute autre histoire. Le calcul de l'absence était cruel et simple. Sur le papier, 223 enfants. En réalité, près de 600. Cet écart, 377 vies, jamais réclamées, plus 142, qui n'avaient jamais été enregistrées. et chacun de ces chiffres n'était pas une illusion. Ils avaient la forme d'une paire de petites chaussures nouées d'un creux derrière la chapelle, d'un fragment d'os dans la cendre. La terre ne ment pas. Les chiffres placés côte à côte non plus. Si les registres étaient faits pour dissimuler alors le terrain de Thornhill, lui-même détenait la vérité. Dans l'espace entre le papier et la terre, l'absence devient preuve. Au printemps 1897, de fortes pluies firent déborder le ruisseau au pied du bâtiment érodant, le sol inondant la cave et emportant des couches de terre compactées depuis des décennies. Lorsque l'eau se retirait, elle laissait derrière elle des choses qu'aucune inondation n'aurait dû exposer, de petits ossements dans la boue des chênes rouillés, des vêtements fragiles à peine assez grands pour un enfant. La nature avait dépouillé Thornhill de son masque. Mais au lieu d'ouvrir une enquête, l'incident ne fit qu'engendrer d'autres activités. Quelques jours plus tard, des charrettes tirées par des chevaux arrivèrent de nuit, transportant des caisses en bois, portant l'inscription SMA, Society for Moral Architecture. Des témoins se souviennent de leur transport dans la chapelle et de leur disparition dans l'escalier souterrain. Personne ne savait ce qu'il y avait à l'intérieur, mais le moment était clair, ce que l'inondation avait exposé avait été récupéré et caché. 2 semaines plus tard, Thornhill brûla. Le rapport officiel invoqua la foudre, bien qu'il n'y ait pas eu d'orage cette nuit-là. L'incendie consuma la chapelle, effondrant le toit et noircissant les vitraux. Documents, registres, lettres, tout fut réduit en cendres. De nombreux témoignages affirmèrent que la plupart des meubles avaient été retirés au préalable, mais que ce qui restait fut anéanti pendant la nuit. Le timing était trop parfait pour une coïncidence, l'eau révélait. Le feu effaçait. En public, les autorités ne firent aucune mention de découverte ou de disparition. Elles annoncèrent simplement la fermeture de Thornhill, invoquant des coupes budgétaires et une baisse du nombre de patients. Il n'y eut ni enquête, ni examen, ni dialogue avec la vérité naissante. Les ravages de l'incendie résidaient dans des documents administratifs, et l'histoire de Thornhill se réduisit à une note financière et non à un casier judiciaire. Ce que l'inondation révéla était fragmentaire, emporté par l'eau ou perdu dans des caisses anonymes. Ce que l'incendie détruisit fut total. Dossiers médicaux, dossiers d'essais cliniques, communication avec les sponsors, tout fut réduit en poussière. Ce n'était pas un accident, mais une modification délibérée, une façon de réécrire la mémoire pour que les absences subsistent. En 1897, l'histoire de Thornhill fut à la fois révélation et destruction. L'eau dit la vérité. Le feu la réduit au silence. Près de 8 décennies plus tard, en 1976, une historienne sociale nommée Alexis Brandt a parcouru l'est du Kentucky pour recueillir des souvenirs populaires. Elle souhaitait documenter la ville minière et l'église de montagne. Au lieu de cela, elle a découvert des fragments qui la ramenaient directement à Thornhill. Des entretiens avec des enfants survivants de cet endroit ont révélé une tendance: les souvenirs n'étaient pas écrits sur du papier, mais gravés dans le corps. Nombre d'entre eux portaient les mêmes cicatrices de fines lignes horizontales aux poignets et aux chevilles, traces de chaînes. L'emplacement et la forme étaient trop constants pour être aléatoires. Elles se sont répétées chez de nombreux enfants pendant de nombreuses années. Si leurs souvenirs s'estompaient, leur corps n'oubliait-il pas. Mais les yeux racontaient une autre histoire. De nombreux survivants ne supportaient pas la lumière et furent contraints de vivre dans l'obscurité ou derrière d'épais rideaux pendant des décennies. Les rapports médicaux ont confirmé des lésions oculaires compatibles avec un confinement sous une lumière artificielle intense ou une exposition prolongée à des vapeurs chimiques. Exactement ce qui a été découvert dans le coffre secret de Thornhill. Les cloches de l'église ont également laissé une trace. Dans la plupart des récits, le tintement des cloches était une peur tremblante, silencieuse, invisible. Pour eux, ce tintement n'était pas un signe de foi, mais un signal d'enfermement. Et puis, au-delà de la cicatrice de la lumière ou du son, il y avait quelque chose, la berceuse. Sans accord préalable, plusieurs personnes répétaient la même comptine d'une voix tremblante. Dors dans le noir que personne ne te trouve, la voix silencieuse sous terre. En comparant les mots, Brandt découvrit que ces mêmes mots avaient été gravés sur le mur d'une cellule secrète. Souvenir oral et preuve matérielle concordaient parfaitement. Grâce au récit, Brandt comprit que l'oubli n'était pas accidentel. Il faisait partie du processus à Thornhill. Les sédatifs, l'isolement, la torture psychologique, tout cela pour effacer la mémoire. Mais l'effacement total n'y parvint jamais. Le corps se souvenait par des cicatrices, les yeux par la douleur, les oreilles par des cloches, et l'esprit, bien que brisé, conservait des fragments de berceuse. Ces fragments de mémoire d'une cohérence glaciale transformaient la rumeur en témoignage vivant. They proved that Thornhill's story did not end with the flood, nor with the fire, nor even with the quiet closure under the guise of budget cuts. Its shadow lived on inside the survivors, not carried forward as full and polished narratives, but imprinted into bodies, into breath, into sleeplessness. Their scars, their fears, their half-remembered verses became physiological archives, evidence etched into memory rather than paper. And in this way, even when ledgers were destroyed, when reports were erased, Thornhill's silence was never complete. Memory itself had turned into resistance, a ghost refusing to vanish, remembering what was meant to be forgotten. In 2022, archivists working through the private collection of a retired judge uncovered an artifact long rumored, yet never verified, a weathered journal, its spine frayed, its pages mottled with time. The cover bore no title. Inside, in a hand both measured and deliberate, were the writings of Ellen Witt, the woman who for decades had appeared only in fragments of survivor testimony, remembered as a shadow draped in white. Some swore she was no more than a ghost. Others whispered she was resistance itself stitched into fabric. The journal confirmed she was also something more, a recorder, a witness who wrote in quiet secrecy, knowing her testimony might never be read until long after her death. Her entries are brief, often only fragments, but their persistence makes the purpose clear. She dated drafts of the trials of mercy. She recorded initials of children transferred to the hidden cell marked 1B. She listed with painstaking care the names she could preserve. One entry describes how she stitched letters into the hems of garments so that even if the paper records were burned, the fabric would still speak. Another entry reveals her fear. If they find this book, I am gone. But if it survives, then not all is erased. The final page carries only a single line. The children were made into silence. No embellishment, no lament. Written with the restraint of a ledger, closing its account. A witness's summation of Thornhill's machinery. Silence was not a byproduct, it was the final product. Today that journal rests locked in an archive vault, too fragile for touch, its contents available only through facsimile. Yet even through copies, the force of its voice remains. In its pages, scattered fragments are reassembled into lives. Delilah the hymnal diarist, whose coded notes mapped the basement. Ruth the name carved again and again into the stone of cell 1B. Anal, the child once smuggled nearly beyond the gates. Marian and Leah, names once spoken only in oral testimony, now confirmed in Ellen's careful script. She wrote them in red ink, across select pages, not merely as identifiers, but as acts of preservation. Each name resisted the arithmetic of absence, pushing back against Thornhill's erasures. Where ledgers were destroyed, Ellen restored. Where fire consumed, her ink endured. Thornhill was never tried in court. No official was held to account. Its closure was explained away as financial necessity. Its ruins left to weather and then fall. But Ellen's witness altered the balance. Her journal carried the names forward, stitched into fabric, etched into plaster, carried in song, written in ink that time could not erase. If justice failed, remembrance became the last ritual. To repeat their names is to resist the silence that sought to erase them. Delilah, Ruth, Anel, Marian, Leah. Each name endures like a verdict, still unspoken, yet undeniable. And in that endurance lies the only conclusion possible. Thornhill's legacy cannot be sealed away. Memory itself refuses to close the ledger. And so as we close the pages of Ellen's journal, we are reminded that silence is never truly empty. It carries echoes, names whispered through fabric lines carved into stone, voices hidden but not destroyed. Thornhill was built to erase, but memory found a way to endure. Tonight, by listening, you have become part of that endurance. If you are still with me, pause for a moment. Write your time and location in the comments below. Let the names of Delilah, Ruth, Anel, Marian, and Leah travel farther than the walls that once confined them. In doing so, you help carry forward what Thornhill sought to bury. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing and sharing this story so others can find these forgotten histories. Because each listener adds another thread to a tapestry that resists silence. The ledger may never close, but perhaps it should not. Perhaps remembrance itself is the only justice that can still be done.